So now I'm going to introduce to you Mick Griffiths. He has an advanced diploma in horticulture management from University of Sydney and a graduate diploma in wine technology and viticulture from University of Melbourne. He's worked in a few different regions, which is very useful. He's worked in the Orange region, very cool climate part of Australia, bit of time in the Napa Valley, and then where things got probably pretty interesting and what he can bring to us today is talking about his time in Tasmania with Brown Brothers, in those fairly large-scale northern Tasmanian vineyards where he would have developed a lot of knowledge of those various sites. The next step in Mick's career, he worked with Domaine Chandon in Victoria, and so it was one of the larger and higher profile sparkling producers there. He's got a lot of knowledge to bring to us. So I guess for someone like me who's pretty passionate about individual sites and seeing what they can teach us in terms of their characteristics and their outcomes in single vineyard wines, I'm looking forward to hearing what Mick's got to say about sites and sparkling wine production. So join me in welcoming Mick.
Thanks, Lou, for that introduction, and thanks to Wines of WA for inviting me to come and speak to you today about growing sparkling wine grapes. I think I've been fortunate in my career to spend a good deal of time working in cool climates and particularly growing sparkling. And I think I've developed a reasonably good understanding of what it takes to grow those grapes efficiently and sustainably and what to look for in a site. Look, growing grapes for sparkling can actually be relatively straightforward when you're also managing Pinot and Riesling and things like that in a cool climate, but I've been very fortunate that I've been working on the right sites in the right locations, so that makes it a bit easier. I thought there was probably two ways to go about this presentation. Do we sit here and go through all the climate data and all the soil data? And I thought that's probably not the best use of our time. So I'm just going to relate some key points that I would look for, and hopefully you can relate that to your own sites or any potential sites that you're thinking of. So firstly, Nick's covered a little bit about what we're looking for in our grapes. There's some sort of key characteristics for sparkling that we want to try and chase. That's sugar and acid balance, and also making sure that we have flavour with the acid at a lower BOME. You don't really have much room to move with sparkling. You can't just sort of let something hang out and get a bit of flavour because it's going to drop its acidity. And obviously that natural acidity is always preferable, and it's a really key part of sparkling wine that is reflected from the site. Obviously we want minimum colour or any impacts from exposure or sunburn. These are big no-nos in good sparkling, and it goes without saying that pest and disease free. Dealing with impacts of powder and particularly botrytis really affect how that fruit's handled in the winery in those early stages of the winemaking process. So if we can keep the fruit as clean as we can, then we're going to end up with much higher quality wine. So what does the site need to provide to give us those characteristics? We need good vigour. We need a healthy canopy right up to harvest. You're probably going to be trimming in most years. That's something to sort of be aware of, I guess. One of the first sort of technical things I went to as a viticulturist was a presentation about vine balance, and the speaker said, if you're trimming, your vines aren't in balance. And I think that's probably a pretty good statement for table wines, but it doesn't apply to something like sparkling because of some of the things that we're looking for. Yield. The vines need to be in balance, but because we're going for a bit more vigour, they'll obviously carry a bit more yield. And don't be afraid of high yields with sparkling. Some of the best stuff I've seen and grown is 15 plus tonnes to the hectare. Vine density plays a big part in that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. That canopy has to be functioning, and it has to be large enough to support the yield that we're trying to produce. It needs to keep those grapes covered, and it also needs to remain healthy post-harvest. Again, I'll talk about that a bit more in the management, but it's one great advantage of sparkling is that hang time that we get after the grapes are off. And the site also needs to provide for efficient management, and this is something that gets overlooked a little bit when we're trying to pick out that ideal site. We need to allow for mechanisation. We need to be quite realistic that labour costs are what they are and labour availability is what it is, and you're going to need to mechanise at least some part of the process, so make sure the site allows for that. So some of the key aspects, quite obviously it needs to be cool. Nick touched on this a little bit, but cool nights during ripening, that sort of fluctuation in, decent days, but nice cool nights are really important. And an overall cooler site is going to give you a later bud burst. And what that means is an overall later harvest. And why that's important is that the grapes aren't going through veraison or ripening during those hot periods of summer. They're really pushing out into autumn. Sparkling's picked earlier, but if the grapes aren't soft and ripening, when you're getting those, heat wave events or anything like that, then that's really going to help. So that's one reason a cool site's very important. Deep, fertile soil. So this gives us our capacity for yield, our capacity for vigour, which helps also to minimise any external inputs. So anyone can grow a big, huge vine if they tip tons and tons of nitrogen onto it, but that's not particularly sustainable either. And the deep fertile soil, it will also take out some of those fluctuations and stress events if the vine's just got more access to moisture and nutrient in the soil. Water supply and rainfall, this can sometimes be overlooked in cool climate sites when we look out the window and it's pouring rain for a good part of the year. But particularly when those vines are young and they're getting established, they can't access most of that soil moisture for a good part of the season. So having that supplementary water there is really key. And also, there's a fair bit of data to suggest that we might be for some more sort of hot, dry periods. And, making sure that you've got water there is going to help with the canopy growth and your yield. And then aspect and row orientation. This is something that can maybe help improve a more marginal site. And I've seen this work in some regions that might be considered warmer climate, but if the vines can be put on a south or an east-facing slope, and then with some clonal selections and things like that, you can actually grow pretty good sparkling there. So this picture is from a vineyard in Tassie, where we've got some Chardonnay growing, basically with 3 different aspects and 3 different row orientations. These ones along the hill, that's a south-facing slope, and I think it was I10V1, and that was always pretty much earmarked for vintage sparkling. If we come just down the slope a little bit, so this is all Chardonnay, and you can see the rows have kicked around a little bit. Now this is table, always earmarked for table, just it got a little bit more exposure and it was a little bit flat and a little bit warmer. And then even closer to the this part of the photo here, that was sparkling Chardonnay as well, but generally for non-vintage. Just because it was a different clone, it was a little bit more vigorous, that part, and the row orientation did change a bit. So that just shows, I think, how aspect can change over maybe 15 hectares of vineyard in a very small area. So how cool is cool? There's lots of different ways to talk about the temperature and climatic conditions of vineyards. So this is just one way. So this is our mean growing season temperature. So basically all the averages of the daily maximums, the daily minimums from October to April. This map comes from the Climate Atlas that Wine Australia put out a few years ago, which was mostly to do with how our regions are going to be affected by climate change. But this image gives us a pretty good idea of how to compare different regions. Now this is just a number. It's it's an average, it's a mean, so we can use any number we want, but as long as it's applied consistently. Now the colours aren't showing up particularly well here, but nor is my pointer. Anyway, we've got a sort of colour here on the side, and if we're under 20, which is basically anything in the yellow to green, we're probably going to be in that sparkling area. So most of Tassie is under 15, maybe pushing to 16 or 17, which compares pretty well with the Yarra Valley, Adelaide Hills, Great Southern and parts of Pemberton. So a better representation is this map, which comes from a different publication, which I'll talk about later, that was put out by the Department of Primary Industries over here. But again, it's looking at that mean growing season temperature, and the numbers are slightly different, but again, we're under sort of 20 degrees. Any of these green and blue regions to the south are probably going to be pretty good. But that's not the be-all and end-all. We can look at growing degree days and mean January temperature and all that sort of stuff as well. So just some other considerations. So we're picking cooler sites. We can obviously increase our frost risk if we're doing that. You need to consider the topography of the site and get some local knowledge of how often frosts occur in that particular site. If you can avoid frost protection, definitely do it if at all possible. It's very expensive, and even when it works really well, it only works about 50 to 70% of the time. So if you can pick a site based on having no frost, that's great. Vine density, this is something that some people could spend all day talking about. It's become a bit of a hot topic in the industry. I think that the number of vines per hectare needs to reflect what that site can carry, and that really only comes from a bit of local knowledge or looking at similar varieties, similar soils, that sort of thing. One thing that I really think is important and something to remember is if you get below 2 metres in your row spacing, you start to complicate things in terms of machinery. Hence, you need specialised stuff, which is expensive, difficult to maintain, difficult to operate. And what you're also doing is you're increasing that soil compaction on the root zone because you're driving closer to the vines. You might be reducing some airflow, so you've got higher disease risk, leading to disease issues. And then you've got the exorbitant cost of trellising and buying the vines and all that sort of thing, and how sustainable is that to go and put all those steel posts and wire in the vineyard. So, yeah, if you can stick above 2 metres, you're probably going to be a little bit more sustainable. And then access, so again, we're in cooler, wetter sites. You're going to be dealing with wet springs potentially, and you're going to need to be in that vineyard spraying or doing canopy management, those sorts of things. So if you can look at managing that drainage before you put your vineyard in, that's obviously desirable, and that's a bit of a mistake we made at this particular site a few years ago. And just to go on with that, doing things before the posts go in, so getting some understanding of the site history, doing soil tests, what was done on that site beforehand, can be really important to how you manage it in the future. Again, before the post and the vines go in, it's a lot easier to get the weeds and things like that under control. Something I've never had the opportunity to do, but if you had 2 or 3 years in the future to plant that vineyard, you could go in and do all your ripping via GPS and then get some, native, low-growing, indigenous ground cover going. Get that all established before you've got posts and vines in the ground. And then really use a minimal disturbance protocol when you're planting. And you've kind of got that big picture of managing the floor under control before you've got posts and stuff in the way. And then labour and resources. So it's no good finding, the best site in the world if you can't go and get people to work there. And I think, with cool climates, we're dictating a lot more management. There's wire lifting, there might be hand picking, those sorts of things. If you're miles and miles away from any labour, then that's going to be a big challenge. We know that there's increasing difficulties in finding skilled labour. And we had an example a couple of years ago at a vineyard that's not particularly remote. It's, it's an hour from a major inland city, but we had trouble getting staff up there. And we'd expanded that vineyard from roughly 40 hectares up to 80 hectares over a number of years. And we'd done a lot of work on, what were the machinery requirements going to be and doing our capital planning and all that sort of stuff, and ended up with 4 tractors. They're all sitting there shiny and new. And then we had a guy retire and another guy got poached, and we couldn't fill those positions. So we had 4 tractors sitting there with 2 people to drive them. So understanding where you're going to access all that labour and those resources from is very, very important when you're picking a site. And just finally, harvest logistics. So I think probably over here in WA you understand this better than most, the distance it can take to travel between harvest and processing facilities. But it's really important, those grapes need to go into the press as soon as possible, whether you're hand picking or machine picking. It kind of doesn't matter, but if you've got these big distances, it just complicates the whole harvest process. If the trucks get delayed, everything gets delayed, people are working back late at the winery. It needs to be a really key consideration. So just finally, some resources to help you if you want to go away and do some research. Obviously, the Bureau has got some great climate data online. Hopefully everyone knows where to find that. You can generally find something for a site nearby or somewhere similar. I spoke about this document, The Geology, Soils and Climate of Western Australia's Wine Regions, was from someone who's not familiar with this part of the world. It was really, really interesting read and goes into a lot of depth about the soils and the climate and really within regions as well. So highly recommend that. A few years ago, the AWRI put out this water budgeting tool, which can help to, when you're looking at a new site, it pulls in some data from the Bureau and you can put in some other things about what you're expecting in terms of production, and it will tell you, roughly how much water you're going to need going into the future. Most people who are irrigating would know that for their site, but it's really a really good tool to look at new sites. And then finally, the climate atlas that Wine Australia produced a few years ago, again, mostly concerned with how our regions might be affected in terms of the changing climate, but it does allow you to compare things between regions in Australia. And it also looks like things like, extreme heat events and frost and that sort of stuff as well. So definitely worth considering. And I think that's about it. So thanks very much.